Alrighty then, this is Susan Fisher. I'm back after Megan Mayuti's presentation for Module 2, so I'm back for Module 3 to continue to regale you about insects and humans, their similarities and differences. You got a fairly comprehensive look at insect and human anatomy as well as physiology last time, and one of the take-home messages from that module is that both humans and insects have a variety of similar problems to solve in trying to earn a living on planet Earth. Both types of organisms have to find food, process it, extract resources from it, and so forth. Both have to protect themselves from physical and microbiological dangers. Both have to breathe. Both have to find mates and reproduce. You also learned that even though insect and human needs are at least superficially similar, both types of organisms have physiological systems that solve the problems of existence in somewhat different ways. You also learned how different structures support different physiological processes in achieving ostensibly similar ends. You covered a lot in just one module, and it takes a while to assimilate that much information. So during this module, we hope to aid in that processing and also increase your understanding of human and insect systems by looking at a single issue, namely reproduction, in a little more depth than was possible in our global panoramic view that we took in Module 2. Again, I think that you will find that insects and humans have similar needs, but that they've solved these needs and problems both in similar and different ways. So you're going to have sort of a compare and contrast kind of thing. We'll look at humans, we'll look at insects, we'll look for overlapping similarities as well as profound differences. Now, for your convenience, this model has been broken into 4 chunks. In chunk 1, we're going to start with the beginning, a good place to start, and address the issue of finding a mate. Nothing else can happen in reproduction until this issue is solved, and therefore it makes a great starting point. Chunk 2 brings us to a discussion of how males and females are persuaded to engage in the act of mating. Again, there are remarkable similarities between humans and insects, despite the gulf of evolution by which they are separated. In chunk 3, we will look at the processes by which mating, also known as copulation, occurs. You've probably been programmed by movies and books, and perhaps even your own imagination, to believe that humans are ingenious when it comes to this issue. But I think you will find that insects have thought of a few things that even filmmaker Wes Craven never entertained. We're not telling you about these things because we think they're good ideas. Indeed, many of them would frankly be illegal, even under today's liberal standards. I'm speaking here of what insects do. But they do make the point rather nicely that nature thrives on diversity and will try anything, even if some of it seems rather counterproductive. And this brings us to chunk 4, where we'll ask and study the question of mating systems. And here you'll find that humans are really pretty boring in comparison to insects. So with that as an introduction, let's get started. And first, let's take up the problem of finding a mate. In contrast to insects, humans have this pretty easy. We are, after all, social animals. We like to hang out in places where we're going to find other people. We go to school, to work, to shopping malls, and of course, to parties. Bars are a very common place to find people, and of course, in bars, you have the added inducement of alcohol there to help overcome inhibitions and make the whole dating thing a little bit easier. So these are some of the time-tested ways of meeting people of the opposite or even same sex whom you might be interested in dating or even producing offspring with. And if you're human, you have even more options to find a partner in the proliferation of dating websites that promise to sort through all the variables available in humans and find you, the one. Now consider the insect, and you've got a fairly formidable set of problems. In order to successfully reproduce, you have to find a member of the opposite sex from the same species. Incidentally, there's a term we use to describe that insects or organisms that share the same species are called conspecifics. So that term will come up from time to time, and that's what it means. Now, if you are an insect and you find an insect that looks like you but is not a conspecific, and you try to mate with it, it's possible that if the species involved are closely related, they may be able to form viable hybrid offspring. But it is unlikely that the hybrids will be fertile. So this is an evolutionary dead end. If you're a beetle, for instance, there are probably lots of other beetles out there. So the question is, how do you get the conspecifics together among the many, many types of beetles present in each locality, recognizing that you do need conspecifics to breed with because that's the only way you get fertile offspring. Insects are fairly small and may or may not have the means to travel, depending on whether they have wings or legs, etc. If they can travel, they're probably not going to go very far, at least compared to humans. So geography is therefore one of the factors that limits finding a mate among insects. A second problem in choosing a mate from a whole bunch of related species that look pretty similar. And what this means is that although most insects have eyes, their ability to visually pick out members of the same species from among many related species is somewhat limited. So we've got this similar species problem to resolve here too. And if we add to that the fact that a lot of insects are out at night, and at night visual discrimination is going to be low to begin with, you start to understand why parsing out which organisms belong to the same species and which to look-alike species is a problem. And then, even if an insect finds him or herself around conspecific insects, he or she may be surrounded by hundreds or even thousands of conspecifics in a particular locality. So the question becomes, how do you choose and attract one individual from that large swarm of available potential partners? Lots of questions. And this slide nicely illustrates the problem of finding a mate among other insects that are not conspecifics, but which look alike. All of these slides show pictures of fireflies, you know, like the species that you used to catch on a summer night when you were a kid, and you put them in jars and take them up to your bedroom so you could see them light up at night. Well, these are 4 different species. These 4 different pictures represent 4 different species, but you can see they all look pretty much the same, and I'm pretty sure that even with your visual abilities, you would not be able to tell them apart. And yet, they are different species. So, none of these fireflies would be able to mate with any other fireflies on the screen and produce fertile offspring if they chose to mate with each other. But insects have ingeniously solved the problem of how to get together with other members of the same species, even those that look alike, in several different ways. But certainly one of the most widely used methods is the production of sex pheromones. The sex pheromones are like other pheromones. They are small, volatile chemicals that are usually produced and released by the female in order to attract a male of the same species. Because the pheromones are volatile, they will easily enter the gaseous phase, and that then allows the chemicals in the gaseous phase to travel broadly on airwaves. And that, in turn, means that the pheromonal substance will be distributed over a large geographic area. In addition, conspecific males have receptors to which the pheromone will bind and activate search behavior in the male in a quest to find the female producing and releasing the pheromone. So importantly, the pheromones are highly specific. Only males of the same species will respond to the pheromone produced by a conspecific female. But interestingly, related insects, like the 4 species of fireflies you just saw on the previous slide, may use similar pheromones, but with enough structural difference to be specific between males and females of the same species. Or closely related species may use a mixture of 2 chemicals, but each species will use a slightly different quantitative mixture of the 2 chemicals. Species A, for instance, might use chemicals 1 and 2 in a pheromone mixture in a 1-to-1 ratio, whereas a related species, species B, might use the same 2 chemicals but in a different ratio, maybe a 1-to-2 ratio. And this ensures that only conspecific potential mates are attracted to one another. So using pheromones, conspecific males and females can be attracted to the same geographic location, but there are still some impediments to successful mating. Just like in humans, you have to have mechanisms for narrowing down the field of possible mates. And once you settle on an individual, a little persuasion may be required, especially if the objective is not just sex, but reproduction. And here, humans and insects show some remarkable similarities. If we start with humans, we could potentially come up with a very long list of criteria for mating, but we can summarize all that long list by noting 2 things. People are generally attracted to each other as a result of specific physical and behavioral characteristics, like how you look and what your various skills are. And these are highly idiosyncratic and hard to generalize, except to acknowledge general categories. A second major criterion is the kind of resources that you are able to bring to the table. You can think of human dowries, gifts that were given and exchanged between families to facilitate a courtship that would ultimately result in children. So in addition to the general physical and behavioral attractiveness, like good-looking people who can sing or dance, there are going to be a list of those things that people are going to use as at least an invisible scorecard for trying to figure out if somebody's attractive and you want to mate with them. It's also alleged that women like a man who is not just willing to have sex, but to engage in, conversation and showing tenderness through cuddling and other non-sexual activities. So those 2 are among the things that spell attractiveness in humans. And of course, it is certainly true that people who have lots of resources like money and property and power are always seen as highly attractive by a significant swath of society. So the question we need to address here is, do insects show these same preferences? And the answer is yes, they do, believe it or not. We're going to set aside the issue of physical attractiveness among individual insects. We really have no idea whether insects have an aesthetic sense or whether it can be practiced at the individual level. But there are certainly insects that attract a mate via musical means, primarily by singing. Usually it is the job of the male to produce the sound, and it is easily perceived by humans when, for instance, crickets or cicadas sing to attract a mate. In fact, the mating activity of these insects is often highly irritating to humans because it can be very loud and persistent and often takes place at night when we're trying to sleep. One might also consider this as sort of an auditory pheromone, as it's designed to bring males and females into proximity And in this case, the pheromonal modality is sound rather than a chemical. And mosquitoes push this whole thing, this sound mating ritual, to a whole new level by having males and females engage in romantic duets. Again, often at night, keeping you awake and also worried about being bitten. Now, some arthropods have serious rhythm and are pretty good dancers. One example of this is the jumping spider, who does a pretty decent cha-cha. The male will do some brilliant and charming dance moves that include drumming on a substrate and some pretty crazy, energetic zigzag moves to impress his intended. I'm going to show you a video clip of a very amorous, earnest male who's literally dancing his heart out for his intended love. Unfortunately, she's dead and pinned to the substrate and can't respond. But he really, really gives it his best, and I think you have to admire that. So I'm going to put a link in the content section of Carmen next to this module, so you can easily go to that and take a look at this very beautiful male. He actually has lovely blue mouth parts that are also quite impressive. In another insect, in springtails, which is considered a primitive insect, the male will not be successful in mating unless and until he pampers her a little and maybe cuddles, as insects might define it. So the male springtail will rub the female with his antennae, and if she responds, he's going to have a pretty good night. So this is an example of cuddling behavior among insects. In addition, male dung beetles show their affection by helping to set up the nursery, which in this case is a ball of dung. And after mating, the female will deposit her eggs in the ball of dung, which will then help nourish the larvae when they emerge. And this then brings up the whole question of resources, like we discussed among humans. Many insects definitely choose a mate based on their perceived ability to provide resources to the intended mate and also support potential offspring. Now, there are many ways to demonstrate resource abundance among insects, but certainly the most charming is the so-called nuptial gift. This is a present that the male will present to the female as an inducement to mate. Now, many of the females are very discerning and will carefully inspect the gift to make sure that it is up to her standards. Indeed, because she's interested in figuring out whether the male is physically fit and likely to produce good offspring. Also, whether he can assist in resource acquisition during the life cycle of both the female and the offspring. The types of gifts that males use for this purpose, for nuptial gifts, are variable with species. But the purpose, as mentioned before, is to provide an incentive for the female to mate with him. But in addition to this attractiveness criterion, it is also, the nuptial gift is also a way for the male to help nourish the female and increase her chances of producing a successful brood. And in some species where the female may be quite a bit larger than the male and also predatory, the nuptial gift is a mechanism to distract the female from doing harm to the male during the act of mating. Here you see a couple of different insects presenting their nuptial gifts. The scorpion fly on the right is delivering a dead insect to his intended as a nuptial gift, and the dung beetle, male, here, gotta love him. Here's your male dung beetle, and you can see this enormous ball of dung that he's presenting to the lady that he would like to mate with. Well, in addition to what you just saw on the previous slide, some species, such as the bush cricket, use what we call a spermatoflax as his nuptial gift. Here's your bush cricket. The spermatoflax is a gelatinous substance which is produced by the male and then presented to the female. The female will ingest the spermatoflax if she accepts him. And then the ingestion of that substance is thought to nourish the female and also assist in egg production. We also see a spermatoflax in the Mormon cricket, which funnels up to 30% of his own body weight into the production of the spermatoflax, which he then lets her eat, even though she may reject him. She may choose not to mate with him, which is, so stereotypically female, right? They just want the dinner and the candlelight and the wine and not so much what comes or is supposed to come later. Scorpion flies, which you saw in the previous slide, have a particularly interesting example of using a spermatoflax. He literally hacks up a salivary secretion and, dripping with spit, he offers it to his beloved. It's also a nutritious gift that helps prepare the female to produce a big litter. And, like the stereotypic human female, the female scorpion fly will consent to sex only if she gets that present up front. But, like a stereotypic human male, the male scorpion fly will collect any spermatoflax not consumed by the first female and then turn around and proudly present it to his next potential partner. Kind of like getting, a used half-eaten box of candy left over from the previous woman, which is, shall we say, pretty classy. A fairly common type of nuptial gift is for the male to offer the female some sort of, wait for it, dead insect to eat if she's insectivorous. The scorpion flies, like the one you saw on the previous slide, do this, but some scorpion flies try to get by without doing too much work themselves, and instead of catching the insect gift, he simply steals a dead insect from a spider web. Others, like the balloon fly, thoughtfully wrap their insect present in a silk balloon, hence the name, prior to presenting it to his lady friend. And the wrapping of the dead insect in silk may serve two purposes. First, it's harder to eat the insects inside of the wrap because you have to remove the sticky silk strands, and this means that the female can't just eat the present and run away. She's got to stick around to unwrap it, and this increases the chances that the male can mate with her. Secondly, unwrapping the silk-bound gift distracts the female and allows the male to mate longer with her and transfer more sperm. It's like, she's doing her nails while he's mating with her, but he doesn't care because he gets to be up there longer and transfer more sperm as long as she's busy doing her nails. Now, some insects lure a female in to a mating arrangement using an aphrodisiac or a chemical designed to increase sexual attractiveness. For instance, males of the green butterfly do this. They have hairs on their abdomen that, when ruffled, will produce an aphrodisiac to attract females. And if she draws near him, he will then proceed to dust her abdomen with the aphrodisiac to increase her willingness. Now, male mealworms go even one step further. After they've mated with the female by drawing her in with an aphrodisiac, the male will then turn around and douse his recently mated female friend with an anti-aphrodisiac to make her less attractive to other males and increase the chances that she will bear his offspring. And we can't leave this topic without giving a shout out to the male dung beetle. Both sexes of the species do roll dung balls, both as a food source and also as a nutritive place to deposit the eggs, where they will then proceed to develop. But at mating time, the male really goes whole hog here, and he will invest quite a lot of work into rolling an exquisite ball of dung as a nuptial gift for his chosen female in the hopes that she will accept him as a mate. His presentation of a large ball of dung to her indicates that he will be a very good resource provider. And in some species, the mated pair actually rolls dung balls together, which I'm sure is a romantic gesture. You know, nothing says true love like a big ball of dung. So now we have come to the fascinating issue of the act of mating, or copulation in more scientific terms. In humans, I am sure that you know the details. It's a pretty simple thing if the goal is to reproduce. Since you've had years of sex ed, I doubt that I need to elaborate. If the goal is not reproduction but sex, humans do like a little variety and will have sex just about anywhere in many positions using several different orifices. Again, I don't think I need to elaborate. But what about insects? Here the options would seem to be both rather prosaic and rather limited, but alas, they are not, and are so numerous that we can't address them all here. But I will detail a few just to give you a taste of the incredible variability and creativity that insects invest in mating. Before we get into the details of the subject, let me first acknowledge that both sexes make significant contributions to the act of mating and copulation, although we sometimes deride the human male contribution as insignificant. But in both humans and insects, nothing could be further from the truth. And as you can see from this list, there are a variety of products that the male makes and then packages along with his sperm as his contribution to reproduction, without which reproduction would be much less successful. And the effects of these additions are very important. They help propel and nourish the sperm en route to the egg that they will ultimately fertilize. They're also important in nourishing the female and or her eggs, and also providing hormonal stimulation to support fertilization. In insects, the male ejaculate even provides hormones that invoke behaviors that will assist in brood production once the babies are produced. In human reproduction, if you want to produce a child by typical means, it's necessary for the male to release millions of sperm into the female urogenital tract in hopes that one sperm will successfully navigate its fairly long way to the egg and fertilize it. The event, as I'm sure you know, takes place usually in the fallopian tubes of the female, and usually the fertilized egg will then continue its journey into her uterus, where it's going to embed in the uterine lining and establish a pregnancy. So pregnancy is basically an internal event in humans, unless pregnancy is produced by artificial means like inseminating an egg or fertilizing an egg outside the woman's body and then implanting the fertilized egg in her uterus. In insects, however, fertilization does not necessarily take place in the female's urogenital tract. In some species, including some spiders, for instance, the male will deposit a package of sperm called a spermatophore somewhere in the outside environment, and the female of the species will then cruise by and pick it up and then insert it into her reproductive system. So this is called external fertilization and is considered a fairly primitive form of reproduction in insects because it doesn't do much to ensure that the sperm and the egg actually get together. And the male of the species can never be sure that the fertilized eggs that are ultimately produced have come from his sperm. Internal fertilization, such as what usually happens in humans, is considered an advanced trait and is found in most insects. In this case, the male has what we refer to as an intromittent organ, which is called by a special name the Aediagus, but it's actually his penis. So I may conflate those terms. I may say Ediagus, I may say penis, but I'm referring to the same thing. The intromittent organ that the male introduces into the female in order to deposit sperm. So the male is going to insert his Ediagus into the female reproductive tract in internal fertilization. Sometimes we also have a special name for the place where he goes to deposit sperm, called the bursa copulatrix, if you like Latin better. But at any rate, that is the normal site of sperm deposition for internal fertilization. And the fate of the internally released sperm can also vary. Sometimes it works like it would in humans, that is to say, the sperm swim along until they find eggs to fertilize. In other cases, the female has a special internal pouch called a spermatheca, in which she uses to hold the sperm and let the sperm out to fertilize her eggs later when she thinks conditions are optimal to support a good clutch of eggs. So we have some similarities and differences between humans and insects with respect to what happens to the sperm, whether the fertilization is internal or external. Now, here we see a really interesting thing in bees. And it turns out that in some insects, the act of mating, at least for the male insect, is not a particularly enjoyable experience. And this is the case in honeybees, where we might say that mating for the honeybee male is an act of sexual suicide. You may know that in honeybees, a specific class of bees is produced called drones, whose sole function in life is to inseminate the queen bee. And at mating time, the queen, which is normally sedentary and hive bound, she's not going to leave the hive unless she's ready to mate. And if she is, she will leave the hive on what is called a mating flight in search of drones with which to mate. The drones will compete for the chance to mate with the queen, and eventually one will be successful in mating with the queen, which requires a fair amount of skill since the mating activity takes place in flight. So, assuming that the male is successful in depositing sperm, the queen will then store the sperm in her spermatheca internally, and she will store that sperm potentially for up to the duration of her entire life, and she will use it when necessary to produce more bees in the hive. So here's the sad part. The drone, as I mentioned, has but one function in life, and after fertilization takes place, he's now completed that one function. And in the act of mating, the release of the sperm from the male is propelled by the contraction of his abdominal muscles that are also under intense hydrostatic pressure. And the contraction of the muscles is so forceful that the tip of his Ediagus is blown off and left inside the queen. Biologists speculate that doing this, having the penis explode and remnants of it staying inside the queen, benefits the male. Hard to understand, but the reasoning is that because the torn Ediagus acts as a plug to prevent the entry of other males' sperm if the queen decides to mate again. But it is all over for that drone, who then crawls off to die, having successfully mated. And at this point, it is fun to acknowledge that some insects have decided that the usual sex roles and sex organs are, just not for them. So here we have an example of cave insects. They are Brazilian cave insects from the genus Neotrogla. And in this case, the female has the thing I just referred to as the intromittent organ, which is, in her case, a penis equivalent. And the male has a simple genital chamber in which the sperm are harbored. And so this has been billed as a female penis and a male vagina, where the normal structures associated with the sexes have been reduced. have been switched. The female intromittent organ is not generally called an ediogus or penis. It's called a gynosome. And at least in the Brazilian cave insects, of which there are several species, it can be elaborately adorned with spines and pouches and other stuff. And at mating time, the female will insert her gynosome, which looks a lot like a penis, into the male cavity or pouch where he's keeping the sperm, and he will then pass to her the sperm in an ejaculate that travels through the gynosome, which she has inserted into his internal pouch. It turns out the gynosome, which receives the ejaculate, it plays an important function. First, in this particular group of insects, the act of mating takes a very long time, between 40 to 70 hours. Think of that, guys and ladies. If you were mating for that length of time, that would be, I don't know, not very pleasant to me. But, others are different. At any rate, this is important in the Brazilian cave insects because the male ejaculate is loaded with nutrients of all sorts. And so the longer the male and female mate, the more of this stuff can be transferred from the male into the gynosome and thence into the female, as well as the sperm that are going to be used in fertilization. So, just another variation on the standard themes that insects do a little bit differently. And some people, some humans, think that they are veritable sexual acrobats because they've found ways of having sex in practically just about any place, including the bathrooms of airplanes in flight. And this is really the only way that humans can have sex in flight, and that is to say, to ignominiously use the bathroom of an airplane, which lacks both space and anything approaching panache. But some insects can literally have sex on the wing and in a whole variety of interesting positions. So let's take dragonflies and damselflies as examples. While in flight, if he's going to engage in mating, a male dragonfly will grab the female's thorax with his legs and then continue flying while the two are attached. The male can be a little bit brutish, and he may bite the female to subdue her if she's acting feisty and looks like she's resisting. But successful mating requires that the male get a better grip on the situation and also bring his genitalia into proximity with hers. And grasping the thorax simply won't provide a way to do this. So in an effort to mate successfully, the male will then pull his abdomen forward and grab the female around the neck with a pair of appendages called cerci that are situated at the hind end, the anal end of the male. And this gives him a better grip, and he will continue to fly with her in tandem. So here you see a lovely picture of a male grabbing the lady friend around the neck with his cerci, and they're still in flight. And now we get to the sperm transfer part, where the males particularly do some really interesting gymnastics. In some species, the male will clean out the female's genital tract with the intention of removing the sperm of other males. Using backwards facing hooks that are on his penis, the male will scrape out any sperm left by a previous male. Once it's clean, his sperm will then be the only source of fertilization. Then, to effect the actual transfer of sperm, these insects have another problem to solve, and that is that there is an anatomical mismatch between the respective placement of the relative body parts or relevant body parts between the two sexes. The female genital opening is at the end of her abdomen, but the relevant parts of the male are located much closer to his thorax. So in order to transfer sperm, the female has to bring the tip of her abdomen close to his thorax where the penis is located. And in order to accomplish this, dragonflies bend into a circular arrangement called the wheel formation because of its shape. And as you can see from this picture, this is a pretty awkward formation to keep airborne. So some species say, oh, the heck with it, we don't need to do this aerial thing at this point. We'll find a nice place, a nice branch or something to alight on and transfer the sperm on the ground. But other species of dragonflies actually do mate in flight, making them true artists of aerial sex. But the mating issues among dragonflies don't stop there. There's another whole level of male competitiveness of which humans, in comparison, are only nominal practitioners. Dragonflies are highly evolved in the art of sperm competition. The foundational principle, biological principle that is that the last sperm in are the ones to fertilize. So males have a variety of adaptations to make sure that their sperm is the last one into the female's urogenital tract and will therefore make him the parent of her eggs. We've seen in the previous slide that one adaptation males use to do this is to have appendages on the oediogus that allow him to scrape out any sperm from previous males. But that's just the beginning. Other dragonflies don't scrape out foreign sperm, but they do their best to beat them into submission by tamping them down into the female's reproductive tract and denying them access to the place where fertilization will take place. Others believe that dilution is the solution to the problem. So males will simply inundate the female's internal parts with lots and lots of sperm, enough to overwhelm whatever sperm might be in there from another male and make the current male the parent. A final mechanism is that a recently mated female may be guarded and watched by the male with whom she mated. He will do a couple things. He will chase away any other males that he sees, and he will stay and do this and watch her and guard her until he visually sees that she has laid some eggs, which should be his. So, talk about intrigue. My goodness. And now we've come to what is at least the R-rated part of the presentation on mating. We know that humans have some pretty, kinky practices, some of them involving whips and chains and masters and slaves and all that stuff. Not that I know anything about it, but for the most part, these practices are not meant to facilitate reproduction. In fact, far from it. They're about having sex rather than having babies, and I think we can safely skip what humans do in this area and move on to insects, which have perfected some reproductive practices that would frankly be illegal if humans took them up. And nothing screams out kinky like the insect known as the bed bug. So here it goes. As you probably know, bed bugs are a big deal because they are a resurgent pest. They were once thought to be basically obsolete, but sadly they have come back with a vengeance. People hate them because they live in your house, and they come out to suck your blood while you're asleep. They also have the interesting property of being what we call stigmotaxic. Let's circle that, baby. Stigmotaxic. Nice, interesting Greek word that you might want to amaze your friends with. What this means is that stigmotaxic organisms like to hide in places where they're closely surrounded by protection, like walls and cracks in the wall. But when you're sleeping, they will come out of their hiding place, wander down to where you're sleeping, and hit you up for a blood meal, and then go rapidly back into their hiding space. So you will find evidence of their visit in the morning in the form of lovely, welts on the back of the neck in this place. It's more typical to find them on the arms and stuff like that, but you see that the welts can cause a fairly significant allergic reaction in people, making them rather large, unpleasant, and extremely itchy. So another reason why we really don't like bed bugs is that in addition to the blood sucking and biting that they do, because of their thigmotaxic habit, they're very difficult to control because they can retreat into these little cracks and crevices, and it's hard to get insecticide in there. It's hard to get other methods of treating, killing bed bugs to work when they're doing this, and so they're notoriously difficult to get rid of once you have them. But the weirdness has only just begun. Now, just for the record, let me state that female bed bugs do have a normal reproductive tract, just like any other common insect. But here's the weird thing. They don't use it for mating. Say, what? Oh no. The male bed bugs have come up with another super kinky idea. Instead of inserting their Aedeagus into the female reproductive tract, they instead tear a hole in the female's abdomen and deposit the sperm wherever the hole is. So here, where's my red dot? You see that spot on the female's abdomen. It should look to you like a big hole, because that's what it is. He's just ripped open her abdominal cavity, and he is in the process of depositing sperm. Look at the stranglehold he's got on her, clipped her over on her back and everything. So this is not something she's readily agreeing to, but he's doing it anyway. Now, of course, a normal outlet for the reproductive tract would be down here, and indeed she has one down there. He just doesn't use it. How weird is that? So he puts the sperm in there, and eventually these sperm will migrate around to where the female reproductive organs are and fertilize the eggs. But because this kind of copulation involves violently ripping a hole in the abdomen where none previously existed, this has got a special name because of its wild and crazy characteristics. This is called traumatic insemination, because the act of insemination involves a significant amount of trauma for the female. The male Aedeagus is also interesting. You see it here. It's got all these spines all over it, and that is one of the ways he's able to get through her cuticle in the abdomen. But another thing to note is that the males of the bedbug are really pretty liberal in their choice of potential mates. The male bedbug will also mate with other males of the same species, and what the heck, if another species comes along, they'll try to mate with that too. So you can draw your own conclusions about the male bed bug. Now, given how violent copulation is in bed bugs, you might assume that the female would do it only once and then die as a result of having that really big hole ripped in their abdomina. But that is generally not true. Many females do survive the experience and will go on to mate again and again. And if you find one of these females, they will show multiple insemination scars on their abdominal cavity. Also, the females produce their own antibiotics internally, and this appears to have two functions. First, it kills the pathogens that enter the female bed bugs with their abdomen torn open, and secondly, it's probably the reason why bed bugs don't transmit human pathogens, which is to say the pathogens are killed by the antibiotics that the bed bug produces. Another weird thing is that the females of some species had developed structures to minimize the damage of traumatic insemination, which seems like a good thing to do. On the outside of their abdomen, there's a structure called the ectospermolage. Let's get our little highlighter out here. Our highlighter. Here we go. Okay, ectospermolage, which is on the outside of the abdomen. And this is basically a signal to the male, hey you, dummy, come over here. This is where you want to rip me open and inject the sperm. And once the sperm gets through the ectospermolage and into the female, there's another structure called the spermolage, or spermolage, that will contain the sperm. So both of these things have evolved as a pair to reduce the amount of damage that is wreaked by the male on the abdominal wall. It also keeps the spermolage also keeps the sperm from wandering all over the place and helps direct the sperm to the female reproductive parts and tissues. And assuming the successful fertilization of the eggs, here's another weird thing. The eggs are born the normal way insects do it. That is to say, the eggs move from the female reproductive tract to the outside world, usually with the help of a tube called the ovipositor. So the eggs will be placed into the ovipositor, and the female will use the ovipositor to direct the deposition of the eggs when they get outside of her body. So this, of course, begs the question, if the fertilized eggs get out of the female the normal way, why doesn't the sperm get into the female the normal way? Why on earth would you have this weird system of tearing the female to shreds when she's got a perfectly usable reproductive tract just sitting there? Once again, this thing may be a question of sperm competition. The females of some species are known to produce plugs, which will go up once she has mated. So she'll mate once, get the sperm from the male, and then use a plug to prevent the entry of other sperm into the reproductive tract after the first male has successfully mated with the female. So traumatic insemination may serve as a device for males who come along subsequently to have a chance of fertilizing eggs. In other words, they just get around the mating plug that the female puts up, and they get to fertilize a female that would normally not want to mate again. Other scientists have suggested that traumatic insemination may reduce the resistance of females to mating. I have to think about that for a while. Why would, I don't know, mutilating you be an inducement to mating? But I guess the idea is that if you have something tearing a gaping hole in your abdomen, you might be focused on that rather than what the male is doing with his Aedeagus, which in this case is the same thing. He's using the Aedeagus to open a hole in her abdomen. So I'm not sure that this suggestion makes a lot of sense, but it's one of the things that is out there to explain this. Another suggestion is that using the abdominal hole gets the sperm closer to where the eggs are more quickly, but that too seems a little bit far-fetched to me because of all the damage it does in the process. But I think it's safe to say that bed bugs stand out as an exemplar of weird mating habits. And here's one more example, but this time the table is turned on the male of the species. So maybe you remember Glenn Close in Fatal Attraction. I know I'm dating myself with this reference, but you already know that I'm roughly 100 years old anyway. And anyway, Glenn has sort of been the iconic, scary female who is willing to kill anyone in her path and terrorize small children and pets just to get the guy that she wants, who happens to be married and has children and so forth. Glenn was sort of an anomaly, rare enough that moviegoers shared in the fatal attraction because, you just can't believe that people behave like that. But among arthropods, the scary female figure is relatively common. And you might even say that it's been institutionalized and is just another way of getting things done. So here's how that comes close to being the arthropod version of Glenn. And we're going to be talking now about the Black Widow. To begin with, the female is quite a bit larger than the male, okay? So here we see female, big black one. Here we see tiny little male, okay? And it turns out that spiders are all predators. So, a female is not paying close attention, might think that the little male is, just another prey item. But, that's just how they roll. And when it comes to reproduction, things get truly, truly kinky. As you would assume, reproduction assumes with a very brave male mounting the female to deposit his sperm. But then here's where it gets weird. The female spider, as a nuptial gift to her intrepid partner, turns around and bites his head off, literally off with his head. And once you've recovered from the brutality of it all, there's actually an underlying biological reason for this. It seems that there's an inhibitory substance in the brain of the male that prevents him from ejaculating. And that, of course, means that he can't release the sperm, and therefore fertilization can't take place. So the female just, reaches down and nips off his head, which then removes the inhibitory substance and allows the sperm to be released so that her eggs can be fertilized. And we have then one male spider minus his head, but he dies in the knowledge that his genes will be well represented in the next generation. And that is how the female earned her name, the Black Widow, because she makes herself a widow in the act of mating. Now, just as in literature, Hester Prynne was forced to wear a big scarlet letter A emblazoned on her ventral surface to acknowledge her sin in the scarlet letter, so too does the Black Widow bear the sign and seal of her transgression, a large red hourglass on her abdomen. And it is a message that we humans might want to take seriously too, because the female Black Widow is one of 2 poisonous spiders in the state of Ohio. She will bite you if disturbed, and the venom in her bite can cause some pretty unpleasant physiological effects in locations that are well distant from the bite. Fortunately, these bites are rarely fatal in humans. They're pretty big after all, and you can dilute the poison in your blood. But if you see a black spider with a red hourglass on her abdomen, you would be well advised to leave her alone, and also be thankful that you are not a Black Widow male. And now, at long last, it's time to talk about mating systems. In humans, once again, it's pretty simple. In terms of sex determination, females will have 2 copies of the X chromosome, making her XX, and males will have 1 copy of the X and 1 copy of the Y chromosome, making him XY. And traditionally, people have said that the ideal situation for a mated pair is to consist of 1 man and 1 woman. And while there may exist an historical preference for this, human history has always entertained deviations from that norm, including serial monogamy, polygyny, which means having several wives, polyandry, having several husbands, and more recently, unions between same-sex people, which has become accepted as a behavioral norm. A final part of our mating system is that we typically give birth to 1 child at a time, although multiple births are possible and today can be produced fairly easily with hormonal intervention. But it's much less easy to talk about norms in insect mating systems because diversity has always been the rule. If we start with sex determination, some insects do it the way humans do it. That's to say, females are XX and males are XY. However, some insects allow for additional forms or castes, as they are called, at least in social insects, and these include the situation in which the breeding female withholds sperm, and the result is the formation of a haploid type having one set of genes that comes from the mother and no contribution from the father. In the case of caste systems, the haploid types are basically a quick, non-expensive way of creating a worker class without investing too much genetic material. As we previously noted, in humans, we almost always give birth to one child at a time. Now, obviously, things are much different in insects, although we will discuss the rare case of a one mother, one child type of modality among insects below. The more usual situation is that a single female will give rise to either hundreds or thousands of offspring in one reproductive event. Most insects are what we call ovoviviparous, or they use oviparity as their reproductive modality, if you prefer. And what this means is that the females will produce fertilized eggs, but these fertilized eggs will be incubated inside the female, and the female will deposit the fertilized eggs on the ground after this incubation period, and they will then proceed to hatch and go through their normal life cycle. However, it is possible for insects to be viviparous or larviparous, if you want to render it that way. We have some flexibility with the terminology here. And this is a really interesting life form among insects. The eggs are produced inside the fertilized eggs are produced inside the female reproductive system, as they are in most cases. But then the eggs hatch while they're still inside the female and become larvae while they're still inside the mother. And so she will eventually lay larvae instead of eggs out into the environment when she's ready to go to that step. And there's one example, which we'll get to in more detail in a moment, in which the female will produce a single egg, a single viviparous egg, which will become internally a single larva. And the mother has special proteins, which we have described as milk proteins, that she can use to nourish the internally born larva prior to the time when it becomes expelled. And one of the notable examples of this is the so-called tsetse fly, which I'll show you a picture of in just a moment. Now, here you see an American cockroach. There's a whole thing on naming cockroaches for nations, different nations, and using that as a mechanism for ethnic slurs, and we'll talk about that later in the course. Now, the female cockroach will give birth to many, many eggs at once, and she does a special thing. She packs them in a container called an ootheca, which you see, here we go, emerging at her abdominal end here. This is the ootheca, and inside of it you'll see hundreds of baby cockroach eggs. Oh, joy. And she does this because it affords them some protection and also some nutrition when she releases them to the environment, which is, as you know, a hostile place to be with predators looking for things to eat and so forth. So this is your basic American cockroach, her reproductive modality with an ootheca, in which the eggs are deposited and protected for a while when they're out in the real world. Here you see what aphids do. Aphids, the females, are ovoviviparous, so the fertilized eggs hatch inside the female, and then she will expel a bouncing baby aphid, as you see here, from her abdomen. And since the aphids are hemimetabolists, which you should remember from Module 2, the babies will look pretty much like mom, but smaller. So here's mom, here's the baby. There are a couple of other structures that haven't been completely developed in the babies yet, but will be as they go through their life cycle. And then finally, here you see the tsetse fly, big ol' mom here. Here's mom. And here is the single larva, single ovoviviparous larva that the female is going to produce and release into the world. And if you compare the size of the two, you can see what an intense investment the mother is making to produce this one offspring. In addition, I mentioned the milk glands that the female has to produce a substance that nourishes the larva while it's inside, that humans have decided is an example of milk for the developing baby. So the point of all this is that clearly insects have utilized lots of the different approaches to producing and depositing offspring in the act of mating. And finally, as we leave the subject of reproduction in insects and humans, we have to acknowledge a couple of really unusual ways of reproducing in insects. In humans, you need a male to produce eggs and a female to produce sperm, and the two have to come together via natural or artificial means. But insects, again, have invested heavily in alternative methods. So here's a cursory look at some of them, starting with parthenogenesis. Okay, up here in blue, parthenogenesis. You may be somewhat familiar with this if you studied Greek mythology, and you would have learned that the goddess Athena sprang fully formed from Zeus's head. So this is one way to do things with one parent. Insects can reproduce by parthenogenesis too, but the parent is inevitably female. However, the offspring can be all female, in which case they would be referred to, where is my thing? Up there, okay. They would be referred to as theleticus if the resulting parthenogenic children are only females. They can be only male, in which case they would be arenitocus, because only males are produced. And a third possibility is that the parthenogenic children could be of both sexes. Again, amazing versatility in how reproduction takes place in insects. Now, there is no field of insect psychology that looks at the impact of the real world on the insect psyche, but maybe there should be if the links between human and insect sexuality are as similar as they seem to be. There are some insects which would have some pretty messed up psychology if there were such a field. So I'm imagining what it would be like for an affected insect to show up at a 12-step meeting to talk about his issues. So here is the transcript from that hypothetical meeting. Hi, I'm Macromalthus debilis, and this is my first 12-step meeting. I know we're not supposed to use first names here, but I think it's important for you to understand my identity issues. It's pretty crazy. As one of the few guys in my species, I need you to understand how I came about. In my family, we completely favor women. In fact, our lineage is so intent on producing more females that we don't even bother with a pupal stage. It just postpones the inevitable, the production of more females. Yes, I live in a real fallopian jungle. Even weirder is the fact that my species doesn't even need guys. Not really. The females become sexually mature when they are in their late larval instar. And here's the kicker. The ladies just produce eggs asexually, all by themselves, by merging two haploid ova together in a process called parthenogenesis. Oh sure, we dress it up with complicated terms like thaletichy, but we know what's really going on here. They're trying to get rid of us guys. Okay, I lied about the no males thing. That isn't technically true. Sometimes, and only very rarely, a female larva will not become a sexually active late instar larva that produces a gazillion female Thaleticus eggs. Oh no. She will instead produce a single egg that contains a haploid male. That's right, the lone male gets stuck with one lousy set of chromosomes. But we males, we get our revenge. Yep, we totally turn the tables on mommy. As eggs, we stick to her abdomen. And when we become larvae, we start eating mom alive from the inside out, from the tail to the head. You know why we do this? You know why we start at the tail and move forward to the head? Because we want to keep mommy alive the longest. And so we leave her brain for last so that she'll survive that long. Now, I'm sure this is illegal in some species, but in one sense, my species is actually enlightened. By devouring my mother, I get to become a winged adult male, which you see here in my beautiful photo. But things go downhill from there. Even though I'm clearly a great-looking adult male, I don't get to mate with females. They insist on handling reproduction solo. So why am I here? Why do I exist? I'm booked next week on Oprah, so maybe she can figure it out. Oh wait, she's female. Okay, so that's it for reproduction in insects. Here's your study guide. Live long and prosper. See you next time for Module 4.